So my name's Paul Edwards. I direct Wheatley Institute here at Brigham Young University. And at Wheatley Institute, we believe that trusted and trustworthy institutions are vitally important. Road markers, signals, guardrails, if you will, for human action. And that they help to coordinate the efforts for a productive, peaceful society. And our core institutions are challenged a bit these days. And that's why at Wheatley Institute, we focus on research-supported ways that can fortify the core institutions of the family, religion, and constitutional government. And it's been an honor to be a part of the Religious Freedom Annual Review for the past several years and be a co-sponsor with the ICLRS. And so anyway, grateful to be here today, and I'm really grateful to be here with my good friend, Gordon Larsen. And Gordon is Senior Advisor for Federal Affairs in the Utah Office of the Governor. And so what that means is he manages the state's relations with, the White House, or Congress, or federal agencies. And Gordon actually came to that position in 2017, a prior administration. So two governors have trusted him with this responsibility. And I'm going to ask if there's someone back there that could close that door. We're getting quite a bit of noise coming in. Thanks. Thank you very much. Gordon, prior to his role here in the state of Utah, governor's office, was congressional staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was also legislative counsel for congressional affairs at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which, remind me, Gordon, that's like...
it's kind of the umbrella agency for Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, a lot of kind of Cold War era broadcasting.
Yeah.
Entities. Yeah.
And you're a native of Kearns, Utah, grew up in Kearns, and attended BYU. I think you're a Cougar. So glad to have you back on campus. And then went on to do your JD and MBA at William & Mary.
Go Tribe. Yeah.
So anyway, Gordon is an avid and he's father of 5 kids and wife to... his wife, Amber, was able to be with him here last night. And anyway, he's also an avid outdoorsman, a great backpacker who has real love for the beauties of the state of Utah. So provide a warm welcome to Gordon Larsen. So, Gordon, one of your responsibilities with the governor's office has been to coordinate not just with federal agencies, but with national organizations like the National Governors Association. And we're going to be talking about some of that today. First, before we jump right into it, tell us what National Governors Association is.
So we have 55 governors. People are surprised about that number. There are 5 territories, and so they each have a governor that belong to this. And it's an association to share best practices among the states, but also as sort of a lever of influence in Washington, D.C. When the governors can speak collectively on something, then it helps move policy in the right direction. And it's hard to get 55 governors to agree on things, but sometimes they do, and people care what they think. So.
And so the governors meet how often?
We have 2 big annual meetings. One is in the, sorry, I'll put this up closer. One is in the winter, typically in D.C., and then the other is sort of at a state. We just happen to be hosting them here in Salt Lake in about 3 weeks. So they move that summer meeting around. But those are an opportunity for the governors, again, to share best practices, to develop relationships that allow them to communicate with each other.
And their governance is that they have a chair, a co-chair. Tell us a bit about that.
So we rotate leadership so that we have 1 year the chair will be a Republican, and the next year, and the vice chair will be a Democrat, and then they switch, and that vice chair becomes the chair, and then somebody new comes in from the other party. So it's very bipartisan by design.
Yeah. And this year, the chair is?
Governor Cox, yeah.
Okay, from Utah.
Cox, from Utah, yeah.
And so that's put him in a particular opportunity. Tell us about the governor's initiatives generally. or the chair's initiatives?
Yeah, so typically the chair will pick an initiative of his or her choosing that is something that their state does well or something that they feel passionately about. So past initiatives have been on infrastructure or healthcare or mental health for children or computer science education, things that they want to share with the rest of the country and feel like this is a moment for them to shine and share a best practice.
Yeah. And so what does infrastructure or childcare or federalism have to do with peacemaking?
Yeah, well, when we sat down, I appreciate your teeing this up for me so nicely, Paul. I should say, too, this is a real treat for me. Paul and I have been friends and colleagues for a number of years, and he's just a wonderful mentor and friend, so it's wonderful to be here with you. So when Governor Cox was asked and elected by his fellow governors to be the chair, he spent a lot of time thinking about some of these standard topics. Do we want to highlight the rising cost of healthcare and things that might solve that solution, or do we want to talk about energy and how we put our country on a better trajectory for energy independence? And ultimately, he decided, none of these really consequential issues can be moved when we all think that the other side is our enemy and that we hate them and we're not even going to talk with them. And so he said, maybe we need to go upstream of some of these standard policy issues that are very important and see if we can tackle the tone of our discourse and see if we can have governors sort of model what good behavior looks like. And it turns out that governors, and I didn't fully appreciate this until we started down this path, but people look at their governors maybe a little bit differently than they do their member of Congress or other elected officials. They have a little bit higher level of trust. They expect their governors to be sort of an adult. They don't judge them quite as much on their sort of ideological purity. They judge them on sort of their management skill. Are you going to be a wise steward of our state? And so we thought maybe this is an opportunity for governors to model good behavior and show what it looks like for a Republican and a Democrat who might disagree on important issues, but they don't hate each other, and they can work together and find some common ground possibly.
So Governor Cox and your team at the NGA and so on came up with?
So we this title that may sound kind of cutesy, but it was by design. So we called this initiative "Disagree Better: Healthy Conflict for Better Policy." And the subtitle there is important, I think. The idea is that it's not just that we want people to be nice to each other. It's that we think good policy comes out of healthy conflict. And conflict is by design part of the title. We wanted to emphasize that conflict is not a bad thing. It's the type of conflict, it's how we do it that's important. And so disagree better. Disagreement is fine, but let's do it the right way.
So Gordon, I think you've brought us something to kind of launch into today's discussion about.
So what I want to show briefly, one feature of this, and we can talk about some of the other pieces of this, but one feature of this and the most prominent public part of it is an ad series. And maybe in a moment I can talk about how that came to be, but let's just show a video. We've kind of spliced together. I have a fantastic intern who just took a bunch of these ads that we've done with governors, and we're just going to show a few of the highlights from a few of these ads. So can we go ahead and show that video if it's teed up?
I'm Spencer Cox, Republican Governor of Utah.
And I'm Jared Polis, Democratic Governor of Colorado.
And we're here to help save your family dinners.
There's a healthy way to deal with conflicting opinions. Actually, it's okay to disagree.
When tornadoes swept through Indiana, we worked together to rebuild. And so many other crucial issues deserve that exact same approach.
Not all disagreements should divide us.
Listen, discuss, and ask questions.
We're here to talk about one of our oldest, most cherished American traditions. We're talking about disagreement.
That's because our country was founded by people who disagreed on just about every issue.
And yet they still got the job done, just like we do.
As the 2024 election cycle heats up, we hope to speak for the entire country in saying,
we don't always have to agree, but we can learn to disagree better.
Our different backgrounds and experiences mean we do a lot of things differently.
And that goes beyond just eating at different restaurants.
But we can have our differences without being divisive or hateful.
We can listen to the other side, ask questions, have important conversations.
There are days when hardworking Alabamians want nothing to do with politics in America.
But we believe that you can disagree and still listen to understand.
So it's okay that we may disagree on some things.
Because changing Alabama and America for the better
means learning to disagree better.
Conflict isn't bad. It's the way we disagree that matters. Please join us in showing America the right kind of conflict.
Together,
we can disagree better.
Okay, so we got this was kind of spliced together, some different things. Where do I find the full set of videos, and how many are there?
Yeah, so we've had 21 governors so far produce these with us, which when we started out, we thought maybe we'll get a dozen if we could.
21.
21 governors, yeah. Now, this is, you'll notice there, if it wasn't obvious, each of those ads had a Republican and a Democrat. Some of them were a Republican governor and a Democrat governor. Some were a Republican governor and a Democratic mayor, or vice versa. Some of the ads are just kind of these vignettes, these solo videos of a governor talking about what it means to practice the art of healthy conflict. But if you just Google National Governors Association Disagree Better, you'll find the videos and all sorts of other resources there. But we're proud of the governors that have done this. And if I could say just one or two things about the reaction to this, it's been universally positive. For the governors that do these, and we can talk maybe more about the implications of this, but they get lots of kudos from their voters and from the local media, which is important because when we started this, we thought, is it going to be them are we asking them to step out on a limb? Are they going to feel like, ooh, I don't know if I want to do something like this? But the positive response, I think, is reinforced. There are people out there who want this kind of content, who like this. They're encouraged by it. And so we've been encouraged by it as well.
So tell us a bit about, so the politics of this, we've seen in the earliest session here, Ryan Burge was telling us that the extremes seem to have the microphones and seem to be driving a lot of things. And yet here is something that says, bring down the temperature, find ways to actually don't stop the conflict. That's an important part of this, right?
Yeah. I was taking lots of notes during Ryan's remarks. I loved it. One of the things he talked about is, and I don't think he used this term, but he was talking about the exhaustive majority. So the polling shows that there's about 70–80% of Americans that belong to what we call the exhaustive majority. And it's not they're all moderates, but they just don't like the tone of the discourse, and they would like to see a more constructive type of conflict that actually results in policy solutions and not just endless bickering. And so that's one of the epiphanies, is that you can do things that speak to them, and they really like it. And so these ads were designed to appeal to that exhaustive majority of Americans, and to some sense kind of counter-programming for what they see in a lot of political discourse.
So the ads exist online. Where else do they, have there been media campaigns in different venues?
So we would love to have the money to sort of do a national campaign that would air next to the Super Bowl, right? And that that money's never materialized. But we've pushed these out on social media. We have a series of, and one of our epiphanies has been there's an enormous ecosystem of organizations around the country that are doing remarkable work. And they've been thrilled to have us as a partner, and so we share our content with them, and they push it out to channels that we don't have. So it's, some of these videos have gotten millions of views, which is encouraging. Again, we would love to have them distributed in channels that would reach millions more people.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little cynical here for a moment. Please. And just say, so big deal, like, it's a little ad that comes across. Yeah. Is there any, you say that there is some indication that they're getting a favorable response in some way. People feel good or something.
But do they work? Right?
But do they work? What is the evidence that even brought you to think that this might be a thing on these ads? And we'll talk about some other aspects of the campaign. But.
So let me go rewind a little bit and go back in time. So 4 years ago, when Governor Cox was running for governor, he was lieutenant governor of Utah, and he was running for governor. And he had this experience. A friend called him. If you remember the first presidential debate between then President Trump and now President Biden was a pretty unpleasant experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think we have one coming up again here soon.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So it happened to be that same evening was the night of our gubernatorial debate between Governor Cox and his Democratic opponent, a wonderful man named Chris Peterson. And a lot of people contacted the governor afterwards, like, that was so refreshing to see an actual debate compared to what we saw afterwards. And he had a particular friend that said, is there anything you can do about this? And he said, well, I'm just running for governor. I'm not running for president. What do you want me to do? Anyway, he was haunted over the next couple of days by this thought, is there something I can do with the level of toxic political discourse? And he noodled on it, and he thought about it, and then he contacted Monday morning. He reached out to Chris, and he reached out to him directly, which is a little bit unusual.
Chris
Peterson.
His opponent.
His Democratic opponent. And he said, hey, Chris, I have this idea. What do you think of doing a commercial with me together where we say, you know, we disagree on important things, but we don't hate each other. And what do you think? And Chris thought about it. And by the end of the call, they said, yeah, let's do it. And so a couple days later, they got together, they scripted it, and they recorded it. And to their surprise, it went viral. And they had media requests from across the country, from international news outlets. They did interviews with the BBC and with German outlets. And it struck a chord with that exhaustive majority. And unbeknownst to us at the time, Stanford University did this experiment, which they called the Strengthening Democracy Project. And it was basically, it was an open study where they solicited interventions that might reduce partisan animosity and proclivity towards political violence. They had 260-something interventions that were submitted, some by university leaders and others. They whittled that down to 25, and then they tested those with a group of 30,000 people. And one of those was the Cox-Peterson commercial. So a university professor from Utah submitted the ad, and they tested it, and it turned out to be one of the most effective ads, or one of the most effective interventions, particularly for reducing support for political violence. And so when we were starting to think about this disagree better idea, and we thought, what kinds of things could we do? What could we have governors do? We sat down with the Stanford researchers, and they said, well, kind of the gold standard of what you could do is get more governors to do these ads. And they said, what we discovered through the research is that the Cox-Peterson ad did at least two things. First of all, it created this level of sympathy for the other side. So a Republican watching that would see, oh, you know, Chris Peterson, I think I disagree with him, but he doesn't seem like a bad dude. And vice versa. A Democrat would say, well, I think I still disagree with Governor Cox, but I could, you know, have a conversation with him. And then the other thing that it did was it created this this level of like, that's good behavior. Like I'm seeing a public official, somebody elite, act the way that I think probably everybody should act. And so those two subtle things move the needle. And so that kind of led to this thought, let's see if we can do more of these and get more governors to sort of model what good behavior looks like. And I will say, I don't want to sort of, I don't want to, you know, drop the news thing here, but Stanford's studying this as well, and so we're excited.
So they're continuing
to study the efficacy of these ads, and we're excited to release that research in a few weeks.
By the way, you've had other empirical work on this kind of play alongside. Frank Luntz, who is a well-known name in political polling and political attitudes and so on, especially kind of from the center right. My understanding is he's volunteered his time in some way.
Yeah, Frank reached out to us about, anybody who's heard of Frank Luntz? Yeah, he's a pretty common name in the political world. Frank reached out to us about 6 months ago, and he said, hey, I just found out about this, and I love it, and I want to know what I can do to help. And we said, well, you know, why don't you do some research for us? And Frank's specialty is these focus groups. So he'll put together a group of people from across the political spectrum, and he'll ask them about certain words. What words resonate, or what do you think of when you hear this word? And so what he did is he sat these a number of focus groups down. I think he did it with about 600 people, and in different groups, and he played some of these ads for them, and they loved them. And people said, "That's what I want to see. This resonates with me in a lot of ways." So very successful.
So Luntz does this feeling thermometer with focus groups. If you've ever seen this technique, and he sort of pioneered this, is the idea that you have people as they're responding to different things. And what Frank would do in the past, and still does, is work closely with people's campaigns to test different kinds of messages, to see who they're working with and with which segments of the population they resonate. So they sit there and people are managing their little dial. Frank came to the National Governors Association meetings in Washington, D.C. this February. Was it February?
Yeah. I'm curious what stood out to you about his
Frank made a presentation to the governors after he had been involved with this. And Gordon, I'll tell you a couple of things that stood out to me in this presentation were, first of all, Frank, who's a pretty kind of hard-bitten, cynical guy. I mean, is that the right characterization? Maybe that's a little too strong. Cynical may be strong, but he's a realist. I mean, he's a straight-shooting guy, and I've worked with him in some other capacities in the past.
He's an operative, right? He gets paid to sort of help people win campaigns.
Yeah. And so real straight shooter. He's not going to sugarcoat things. But he stood in front of, and it was about a dozen governors that were at this particular meeting, and he said, I am here frightened by what our polling is showing about the level of toxic polarization in our current environment. We have never seen anything like this in, the 30 years of his work about, and we hear these kind of statistics, but Frank was emotional. I've never seen him emotional in this way, to say, we have a serious problem, and he said, our materials indicate that this group here, governors, are the group that may be able to have a difference on this.
That was striking.
So he said both the polling about the toxicity was very high, but then looking at trust of public officials, governors are among the last group standing where there is some measure of trust in the public about what the governors are able to provide. So Frank shared both those things. And then he said, he started to show these feeling thermometers as people were watching this. And it was Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Yeah. And do you remember what those feeling thermometers showed as they were sharing these materials?
Yeah, I mean, and I should say, I think what he was testing, what he was showing was mostly the vignettes, and I didn't put any of those in this video. But as governors talked about, no, people didn't particularly like sort of wording around like compromise or something, but they loved the idea of treating people with respect and listening to their side, expressing curiosity. I think those were concepts where the dials went real high.
Yeah. And so anyway, this seems to have some impact, and the Stanford materials show this as well. So we do know, and I'd love for you then to say a bit more about other aspects of the Disagree Better campaign. So this is one little piece, but a pretty important one because of what it's modeling by elites. But continue.
So let me share another kind of. So I shared sort of that reason the governor's sort of concerned from the perspective of the friend who said, this is just anything you can do. One of the other sort of catalysts for this initiative, which I think will start to answer this question, is there was again, going back a couple of years, there was a group of governors that had been invited to the Swiss embassy in Washington, D.C. for a reception. And the Swiss ambassador stood up and he gave the remarks that you would kind of expect an allied nation to offer, of talking about the important ties, economic ties between Switzerland and the United States, and how much he loves the United States. And then he kind of pivoted and he said, he said, I grew up during the Cold War, and I knew when we won the Cold War to whom Europe owed its salvation. It was to the United States. And he said, I was in Berlin when the wall fell, and there was no ambiguity about who was responsible for that. And he said, but we as your allies, we're not sure if we can trust you anymore. And there was this sort of palpable, like, where is this going in the room? And he said, we see a country that's just at war with itself, that's bickering over things that in the big scheme are maybe not that important. And you're neglecting the role that you've played for the past 80 plus years on the world stage. And we don't know if we can trust you. And this, when he was offering these remarks, it was 2 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, just about 2.5 years ago. And he said, we see dark clouds on the horizon, and we need the United States to get its act together, essentially, and to play the role that it has historically. That had a big impact on the governor. And since then, he started asking questions of others that had this sort of view of American influence in the world, economically, diplomatically, militarily, and consistently kept hearing the same thing, that we're concerned. And polarization is not just a domestic issue. And he heard that from former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates. He said, polarization is the #1 issue right now that worries me. Jim Mattis, another former Secretary of Defense, said essentially the same thing. So that all led to sort of what can we do? And the ad series is one piece of it. The other big lane that I'll reference that's been interesting, and we have a number of groups here. I was just with our friend Tammy Pfeiffer from in the back there. Hi, Tammy. Tammy's the chief of staff to Tim Shriver and works on the Dignity Index, which is a fantastic tool. If you all weren't in that session, I encourage you to look up the Dignity Index. But there are an enormous, this ecosystem of organizations that are concerned about the problem, and these organizations span the political spectrum, and they're doing fantastic work. I know, Paul, you've been affiliated with Braver Angels, which is one of the larger and really effective organizations. So we thought we don't need to reinvent how to do this. We just need to sort of help them scale up, and maybe governors can be a way to do that. And so we've held a series of conferences around the country where we invite governors to come and to learn with us about this work, the science behind polarization, what types of interventions are working to reduce it, and how governors might be able to help scale up. So one of the stories that Tammy tells is coming to one of our conferences and connecting with the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Stitt, who's a fantastic Republican governor, but who is also concerned, as we are, about polarization. And so they introduced him to the Dignity Index, and he's done a video with us. He's done some enormous work with Tammy's organization. So that story has played out on a number of fronts with these organizations that are doing really good work, trying to combat it from different angles. And we can talk about maybe some of the ways that they're doing that we think are really effective. But it's been fantastic to see their work advance side by side. So
you've been able to, through National Governors Association, amplify that kind of work around the country in these regional meetings.
And when you see, so this work of depolarization or bridge building or whatever we want to call it, what these organizations will often say is we can reach, a few dozen people at a time, sometimes a few hundred people at a time. But what we really struggle with is how do we scale up and reach millions of people at a time? How do we make this and put it into the DNA of our political discourse? And so that's been the thought. Maybe we can use governors as sort of a lever to scale up that work.
Okay. So what are your thoughts about the scaling up?
I think it's going really well. Let me just share a story. Some of you, who knows of Judge Thomas Griffith? I know there's probably a few, more than a few. That's great. Wonderful.
The Tom Griffith fan club.
The Tom Griffith fan club. Good. I'm in that club. So Judge Griffith, former Judge Griffith, retired Judge Griffith is affiliated.
And a fellow at Wheatley.
Fellow at Wheatley. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a wonderful human. And he's been sort of the nation's foremost ambassador for this idea of civic charity. He also organized a wonderful event for us back in D.C. when the governors were there a few months ago at the National Cathedral. And what that was basically Governor Cox and Governor Moore, the Democratic governor of Maryland, who you saw in one of the ads there. They've become close friends, and they spoke together on stage about the importance of this idea. We had a couple of other panels that were just wonderful thought leaders on this space, and it was actually very focused on faith, right? It was sort of what can faith leaders do to combat polarization, a lot of the themes that we're discussing today in other venues. And he's had enough success, there were over 1,000 people there, that they've decided to sort of do the same thing around the country in other sacred spaces. So these unifying events in sacred spaces, bring governors and other public officials there, and let's see if we can sort of use our common identity of faith as a way to combat polarization.
Yeah. I was part of that. Wheatley Institute was one of the sponsors for that at the National Cathedral. And, very interesting to see, Gordon, right, how stepping into a sacred space like that almost immediately helped to elevate the conversation. That is, that here we were going to be talking across difference, a Republican and a Democrat speaking, and there we were in this, if you've ever been to the National Cathedral, just an extraordinary, beautiful facility. And there is a real spirit about it as you step into it, the majesty and the sacredness of that space. And so Tom Griffith has championed the idea of going forward with this. And I think I can share today that we're going to be holding another one of these events with Governor Stitt from a Republican governor of Oklahoma. We'll be hosting that in Oklahoma on August 7th. And the space we will be in is the Oklahoma City bombing memorial, that area, which of course is a very somber and sacred space in that community. And it's something that in that community represents, a unified place of gathering. And I don't think we know yet who he will be visiting with, but again, it will be one of these elevated conversations.
Yeah. If I could, I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but when you dig into the research on polarization and the evidence-based strategies for reducing it, one of the interesting things, and we didn't realize this when we started down this road, is that identity plays a really important role in this. And so one of the beautiful things about these unifying events in sacred spaces is that it helps people place the identities in the right place. So when you, and this came up in Ryan's remarks, I feel like, this morning, when he talked about the importance of being able to sit and worship with people who you may disagree with, vehemently on political issues, but I can't remember who it was. He said Bob. His example was someone named Bob. Well, I know Bob's not a bad person. I disagree with him, but we worship together. I know his family. I know what he does, and he's a good person. And so it turns out that when we're able to de-emphasize our political identities and make other identities more salient. So I'm a Republican, but that's way down the list. First, I'm a father and a husband and a Christian and a Utah Jazz fan and a BYU Cougar, and all those matter to me way more than my political identity, right? And I'm certainly not going to destroy a friendship over that. Well, these events and others like them help people sort of put politics in their proper place.
Yeah. Gordon, I also want to just chat with you a little bit about the people that you've mentioned, some of the different activities, some of the groups that you've helped to elevate, but the way that the whole effort has been educated. Talk a little bit about some of the advisors that have been gathered around this.
Yeah, well, you've been one of them, Paul, so I appreciate that. We came to you early on, and you practice what you preach, and I think Wheatley's just been a fantastic partner in this. And I know later today we're going to learn more about or maybe it was the last session. Did you just talk about
No, it'll be this afternoon.
This afternoon,
yeah.
Okay. So I won't spoil that and drop the news ahead of time, but that's a great effort. So I think
it's a toolkit for families, for parents. It's an online toolkit that we developed with Utah State University around some of these principles about how to
teach your kids
these kinds of ways to talk to each other.
So you've been fantastic. I will say there's a number of great thought leaders. So we know Arthur, everybody knows Arthur Brooks is sort of the godfather of this, and he is wonderful, and he's been a great counselor to us. One of them that you and I were talking about last night is, and I would say maybe the single most influential kind of public intellectual in our thinking is Yuval Levin at AEI. And Yuval Levin wrote a book that I can't recommend highly enough to everyone that's called A Time to Build. And he talks about the declining trust in institutions, and that's kind of a sobering topic over many decades, that the declined trust in the media and organized religion and the presidency and Congress. But he leaves the book with this remarkable optimistic note of we can all do what we can do in our spheres, and whether that's working for, or whether that's volunteering at a Kiwanis Club or a Rotary or the Boy Scouts or being involved in our faith community. But we can all, instead of trying to save the world, let's just save our communities. Let's work within our spheres. And that's had a huge influence on our thinking. Yeah. We can't do this alone, and a one-year initiative from a group of governors is not going to change the world. But it can certainly make a difference, and it can provide some hope, and it can provide sort of a toolkit in some sense to public officials about how to behave. It can also provide sort of a toolkit for potential future elected officials. So, okay, there is a pathway to elected office that does not involve sort of the scorched earth, contempt-filled tradition that I've seen modeled for so long now. And so I think that's, Yuval's been fantastic. I'll mention the Braver Angels leadership, David Blankenhorn and Monica Guzman. Tammy, I mentioned before. I could go down the list. One of them I'll mention as well that I encourage folks to look up is a remarkable scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her name is Rachel Kleinfeld, and she's helped us understand a concept. You stop me if I go on too long here, Paul, but it's the idea that we don't have to actually set our politics at the table. Sometimes people hear this disagree better idea, and the pushback is, you're telling me to just kind of moderate and compromise what I believe in really strongly, and I have no interest in that. And Rachel said, no, that's not what we're asking people to do. The important piece is that you tell people you can keep your strongly held ideological positions, but just don't frame the other side as the enemy or as bad people or as an existential threat to our country. You keep what you believe, but don't frame the other side as bad people. So Rachel's been fantastic.
And can I probe on this just a little bit? So Rachel comes out of an international conflict background, right?
That's her specialty.
So she had been looking at, issues of international conflict, places like Rwanda, what devolved so quickly there. Colombia and so on. And was able to bring some of the language that we know through international conflict to start to look at domestic issues in the United States. And one of the things I find interesting there, Gordon, is her emphasis on there are lots of places with strong political polarization.
Yeah.
But the thing that's changed in America, and we've had political polarization. I mean, go back and you know, there's a lot of contestation between the two major parties. What seems to be different in this time is something called affective polarization. Say something about affective polarization.
So that's affective with an A, affective polarization. And the idea of affective polarization is that it's not just that you're wrong. It's that you're a bad person. You're not just wrong, but you're evil. And that's the essence of affective polarization. And that's what makes the U.S. a little bit unique. Our levels of political polarization are relatively similar to those in other parts of the Western industrialized world. But it's the affective polarization that you're evil, you're bad. That's what's the distinguishing feature. And the sharp, it's what drives the sharp increase in political violence.
Mm-hmm. And this seems to be an opportunity for religious organizations to engage, I would think, right? So out of so many of our traditions where we believe that all humans are God's children in some fashion, or however you phrase that, at least created in the image of God in some way, that provides, and this is something that ICLRS has emphasized so effectively for so long, is dignity, the inherent dignity of each human being as a central tenet of international law, for example, right? So these concepts, as they tier up, sometimes from a religious background, sometimes from a human rights background, seem to be, somehow we need to bring them back into our civil discourse.
So it turns out, too, that so some of the interventions, and I keep going back to these interventions, but some of them are effective temporarily. So you can bring together a group of Democrats and Republicans and teach them that they're not terrible people and they're your neighbors, and that's a good thing. But it doesn't last very long. So the science shows that you had good experience like that, you'll eventually kind of revert back to where you were before that experience. But what's really powerful, the interventions that are effective long term, are the ones like continually exposing you to people who are different than you in a setting like a church. So the folks that attend church regularly with people who are different than them, that's the most effective. So it's institution building, right? It's building these routines into our civic life. So it doesn't have to be a church. That's, I think, one of the most effective ways. But if you are finding some institution to engage with and where you have a role that gives you some place to serve and belong other than politics, that's the most effective way for people to lose that political edge.
Yeah. And I like this point about, that our identity begins with that commonality in some way.
Yeah.
And too often, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this, right? Where I am one of these people, I'll see a tweet or something come across from a particular organization. Before I even read it, I've made a judgment about what that content might offer me based on the label and the way it sort of triggers something in my mind, either positive or negative.
Yeah, I was, one of the notes I jotted down as Ryan was speaking this morning is a quote from our First Lady, which is, "It's hard to hate up close." So it's really easy to do behind a keyboard sometimes. But when you know that person and you've interacted with them, it's really hard to see them as a terrible person.
Yeah. And of course, social media has made this all the more toxic in different ways. So, well, listen, we'd love to get some of your questions and comments into the conversation here. And I don't know if we have roving mics. I see someone back there. So, and I do want to just note, we do have with us Tammy Pfeiffer, who is the executive director of, or what, of the Dignity Index. Again, if you weren't able to participate in they were doing to work with attorneys today to talk about use of the Dignity Index, I'm actually going to ask you in the back there, I'm going to, as point of privilege here, hand the microphone to Tammy. And Tammy, just tell us a few things about Dignity Index, how we might use it, because I think that this is an important part of the conversation here.
And thank you, and thanks for bringing it up. Thank you, Gordon. We have compiled or have produced a tool called the Dignity Index. And we have designed this to be used to examine portions of speech, political speech, but also public speech. We feel that the antidote to contempt is dignity, and that we need to know what contempt looks like. Sometimes we gut check and we think we know what it looks like, but sometimes when we see what that language really is, we realize that we use it. And so we want to teach people the language of contempt, but also, more importantly, the language of dignity, so that instead of saying on the contempt side of the scale, we're the good people and they're the bad people, that would put me at a 3, almost at the bottom of the scale, I can say, I'm always going to talk to the other side. I'm going to find out what we have in common, which is a 6. And 7 is I'm going to find out what we don't agree on, because I think you're a bad person, but let me find out more about it. Let me ask you some questions and see what brought you to that point. So we pilot tested this in Utah in October of 2022 during the midterms, and had students from the University of Utah who provided us some really great lessons learned. The top lesson being they wanted to do this so that they could score the other side. Well, we've got a great clip of a young woman who said, I'm on the left and I couldn't wait to score those Republicans. And she said, and then I started listening to my liberal commentator, and she said, I scored him and he was at a 4, and then he was at a 3, and then he was at a 2, and she said, and then he called the other side pigs. He called those Republican senators pigs, and she said, that's a 1, and I had to stop listening. I realized that it wasn't the Fox News pundits ruining the country. It was people like me who listened to contempt on my side of the aisle. So she now works for us, and we are spreading this message of dignity and trying to elevate dignity over contempt and teach people what that looks like and how they can speak in a different way.
Thanks so much, Tammy. And where can people find that resource online?
Well, I will leave cards at the back of the room. You can go to dignityindex.us, and we have all kinds of resources there. We have videos there. We have a YouTube channel where you can see what we're doing in real time, and we are so excited to support Gordon and Governor Cox's initiative with Disagree Better, and especially the work that we've been doing with Governor Stitt, which has been a huge success.
Now, before we open to audience here just say where the resources for the National Governors Association Disagree Better can be found.
So I'll give you the URL, but it's probably faster just to Google NGA Disagree Better. You can find it. But it's nga.org/disagree-better or something like that, but just Google it.
Okay.
So can I say something real quick about
one
of the fantastic features of what Tammy's doing with the Dignity Index is that it's an answer to this question about what how do you, so our goal of the Disagree Better initiative, Governor Cox's goal has been, let's change the permission structure of politics in a way that politicians actually see it as beneficial. So it's not just that we're asking them to behave this way out of a sense of civic duty, but because it's actually good politics. Like there's this exhaustive majority out there that wants this behavior from their elected officials. And I think what Tammy's doing with the Dignity Index, so you just envision if you go to a town hall, and we've all been, or maybe many of us have been to a town hall where voters are asking the candidate about, what's your position on health care? What's your position on gun rights or whatever? What if we had people showing up and saying, I've got this Dignity Index here, and I love your positions, but I want to know, how do you feel about treating the other side, even when you disagree, with dignity? I mean, that's something that's important to me as a voter. How do you feel about that? Is that something you could do? If we elevate treating people with dignity to the level of these other issues, right? So it's not just this, like, that'd be nice if they were nicer, if they were more polite and more dignified, but that's actually something I'm going to consider when I'm voting. Yeah.
Hold on for just a sec so they can get the thing here, Randy. No, I know. Right here. See, we want everyone to hear.
Okay. Hi, my name is Randall Paul. I'm here with my colleague, Bahman Bakhtiari, who runs the Baskerville Institute. I run the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and about 12 years ago, one of my colleagues, an evangelical in Georgia, and I tried to get the congressman in Washington to agree to a similar statement on dignity, that we will not engage in politics with a tone that doesn't show dignity to our opponents. And we presented it to every congressman. We had 2 takers. The reason being, it wasn't good politics.
Yeah.
In other words, they'd already done their focus groups, and the sexy stuff was not getting along. And so I'm very curious if we did today, if how much
it's a good
change.
I think it's an open question.
There's some interesting research that Dartmouth has done. So there's one of our, I mentioned some of our partners earlier. There's a number of academic labs that are studying these questions, right? So there's one at, I mentioned Stanford. Dartmouth has their polarization research lab. Duke has some work in this. Columbia does. And one of the things that Dartmouth's come up with is that negative campaigning actually, it's widely used and widely perceived, and it may work, but it doesn't work nearly as well as people think it does. And much more effective is just traditional get out the vote and sort of generic advertising. Those are much more effective than negative. So again, one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of show that you can be very successful, and it's not a moderation sort of thing. It's not moderating your positions. You can be a successful progressive or a successful conservative by behaving this way. And if we can do that, then we change, then you get many more people who are like, oh, yeah, okay, well, I'll do that. Yeah, it's in my interest to do that. Exactly. We're less concerned at this point about whether we've changed their heart. We're more concerned about their behavior, right? Yeah.
Yes. Paul.
The news media seems to drive this, disagree terribly thing. And how is there a way or an initiative to try to work with the news media on this? I mean, 2 guys getting along like in this restaurant is not going to be big news.
Yeah, good point. So I used to be, in a prior life, I was a newspaper guy. And, the thought was that if it's controversial, that's what drives clicks and so on. There's certainly, some evidence that that's the cheap and easy way. But, again, we find that there really is a hunger and readership. There's a whole project called Solutions Journalism that has found, particularly among the younger generations, Gen X, Gen Y, so on, Gen Y, Gen Z, that they really are looking for solutions rather than just this emphasis around the problems. And that a lot of their tuning out of traditional media had been the overemphasis on sensationalism and polarization in certain ways. Now, again, that's sort of through polling, and our behaviors sometimes belie us in the way that we actually behave. But what's happened? What have you been able to do with engagement with journalists?
It's a great question, Paul. I don't have a perfect answer for it. I will say, like lots of large societal trends, it's polarization. It's not monocausal. So social media and the media play a role. It's not the only feature. But I'll do my best, sort of Governor Cox, parroting here, which is he's been sober from cable news for 11 years now, and he will tell you that his marriage is better, his relationships, friendships are deeper, more meaningful, and so I encourage folks to just turn it off. And I've not watched cable news for many years now, and I don't feel any less informed. In fact, I'm probably better informed. And
you consider yourself well informed?
Well,
Okay.
So I think that's part of it, is that we're part of the market. And to the extent that we don't become customers of the polarization industrial complex, I think that's a positive step. But I think we can also, to Tammy's work, I think we can engage in proactively trying to change that, not just sort of step away from the toxicness of it, but we can engage in elevating the speech that's a good example of how we should behave.
Okay, great question. Yes, back here. I know, but John's bringing you a microphone.
You're fast.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do you have any plans or ideas for being able to measure the impact or an effect of the commercials? Part 2.
Yeah.
Are there other efforts you're working on in addition to commercials to reach more of the mainstream? And I don't know if that's more of the emphasis or if it's the leadership training or the both. But yeah, just other things you're doing to try to make change.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that Stanford is continuing to measure the efficacy of the ads, and so that will be an ongoing effort on their part. So there's several other sort of products that we think we're going to have coming out of this in the near future. One of them is what Paul mentioned, this toolkit for families. Another is a collaboration with an organization called the President's Forum, and they're a collection of about a dozen or so, mostly online competency-based institutions. So here in Utah, we have the Western Governors Association. A lot of them are, there's Colorado State Global, that's affiliated with Colorado State University. There's Purdue Global. There's UMass Global. There's a number of others. And these are organizations that are deeply interested in producing workers that are sort of prepared for the work. So it's not a traditional 4-year college experience. They're often sort of students who are returning to college after some years away, and so they're deeply interested in what do employers need. Well, one of the things that employers want is people who know how to manage healthy conflict in a workplace setting. And so we've been working with them, and we'll have more to say about this soon, but the idea of creating a consortium of curriculums and trainings for universities around the country that they could pull off the shelf and incorporate into any number of their classes and their curriculums that teach people how to manage healthy conflict. Now, certainly in a political setting, but also in a workplace, in a family setting. Most people, most Americans, the time that the most interaction they will have now with people who are different than them is in the workplace. It's 8 hours a day in the workplace. And so employers are deeply interested in having employees who know how to handle conflict in a constructive way. And that's totally one piece of it.
Yeah. By the way, if you're looking for a resource on that, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation has a way of working with Fortune 500 companies on helping to think about accommodating religious pluralism and the potential for conflict there and manage that better within the workforce. And talk to our colleague Paul Lambert about that.
No, that's great. And I was happy to see Interfaith America is on the agenda for later today, or somebody from Interfaith America. They're a wonderful group that does similar sort of faith-based work. The One America movement, I think, is another group that does great work in that space. I will also say that I think there is a lot of interest. There's an organization called the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and they everybody familiar with Jonathan Haidt from NYU? Wonderful individual who's worked a lot on sort of social media and the influence that it has on youth. But he also founded this group called the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and they get hired by Fortune 500 companies to come and train them. They get hired by universities as well to come and train their faculty and staff on the skills of healthy conflict.
Great. And by the way, I know not everyone's able to get to each session. Southern Virginia University gave a very interesting presentation today about what they're doing to ladder through their curriculum a peacemaking mindset among their students and their graduates. Any other questions out here? Yes.
So, thank you for this wonderful presentation, and I posted the governor's, probably one of his first ads.
Thank you.
It was right before Thanksgiving, and I posted it on Facebook, and it got like 5 likes, and I thought, So I think everybody was just a little bit afraid. They didn't know what to do with it, didn't know, is this a good thing or what? Anyway, but I felt really good about posting it because I believed in what they said, and I really appreciated our governor standing up for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do more, post more. We'll send you more. Yeah.
And it is interesting to see the variety with the different governors. If you go to the NGA site and see these, and some are really clever. And
some governors are clearly not very photogenic, but it's almost endearing, right? It's like they really mean it, like they care about this, right? So yeah.
Yes, Randall. And we'll make this our final question here.
This is a question. How are you going to keep this great, both corporate America, educational America movement from becoming what diversity became?
Yeah.
In other words, it became an enormous polarizing
thing in and of itself.
You know,
right?
So the very word diversity, you know, today it's left and it's out, and it's come. You know, how are you guys going to keep that from happening?
That's a very thoughtful question, and we spent a lot of time noodling on how do we do that. So one of the things I would tell you, you'll notice that civility is not in the title, and civility is not a bad thing. We need much more civility, but civility is people hear civility and they think, probably particularly on the right, I would say, Paul, you can disagree with me on this, but they hear civility and they think compromise, moderation. You're just asking me to like let the liberals win on everything, right? That's the critique. And so we're framing this again as this is about conflict. And I will tell you, we've been very deliberate about the sponsors that are financing this effort. So we have everybody from Stand Together, which is the Koch Foundation, to Hewlett and Packard, which are more center left, to all sorts of other philanthropies and corporate sponsors that span the political spectrum. And that was very deliberate. We want everybody to recognize this is not on one side or the other. Most of the organizations that are deeply involved in sort of the bridge building world are center left, and that's just how it is. And so again, this was sort of like Governor Cox can play an important role here because he's a conservative governor from a red state. And so I think it's a fair concern and it's a fair question, and it's one that we're very deliberate about. We've got to keep this from being perceived as being one side or the other. This has to be about saving America by fostering healthy conflict, which leads to better policy, but it also leads to America's continued leadership in the world.
Well, please join me in thanking Gordon Larsen for taking time with us today.